Pre-Colonial Black Africa by Cheikh Anta Diop. Chapter 7. Ideological Superstructure. Islam in Black Africa. Analysis of the conditions in which Islam succeeded in Africa will lead us to see the part it also played in civilizing the country. Only during the Almoravid movement of the first half of the 11th century did some white people, Berbers, attempt to impose Islam on Black Africa by force of arms. Yahya ben Ibrahim, head of the Lemtuna and Judula tribes, which respectively occupy the regions of Mauritanian Tagant and Adrar, was the originator of that movement. On his return from Mecca around 1035, he brought a preacher, Abdallah ben Yassin, to convert the members of the tribes under his jurisdiction. The first result was a total failure. The preacher was on the point of leaving when Yahya succeeded in convincing him it was a good idea for the two of them to take a retreat in a fortified monastery on an island at the mouth of the Senegal River and lead an ascetic life, which through their example might attract some disciples. This was the beginning of the Marabout movement in West Africa. Marabout, from the Arabic El Morabatin, meaning living in a monastery. Almoravid in turn derives by alteration from El Morabatin. According to Ibn Khaldun, when the number of disciples had reached 1,000, Yassin said to them, "1,000 men cannot easily be beaten. Therefore must we now work at remaining steadfast in holding to the truth and forcing, if need be, everyone to recognize it. Let us leave this place and fulfill the task imposed upon us." Peaceful penetration. The Almoravids besieged Autochthonous and Ghana. This was the only time white troops attempted to impose Islam through violence. One of Yassin's disciples, King Ura Diaby, converted part of the Tukulor on the Senegal River. They became zealous allies of the Arabo-Berbers in the Holy Wars from the 11th century on. The Almoravid thrust pushed northward across the desert through Silgilamasa and the Maghreb to reach part of Spain. It did not spread in West Africa to the east and south. Conversion of these regions was to be the work of autochthonous marabouts. The primary reason for the success of Islam in Black Africa, with one exception, consequently stems from the fact that it was propagated peacefully at first by solitary Arabo-Berber travelers to certain black kings and notables, who then spread it about them to those under their jurisdiction. This was the case, according to Bakri, with the king of Mali, whom he calls El Musulmani, and who must have been none other than the Mandingo king Baron Mendana Kieta, 1050, of whom Khaldun speaks. A Mohammedan traveler abided for a long time with him when drought swept the land. Legend has it that he caused it to rain by his prayers. The king, who took this to be a miracle, then converted to the new religion. What is to be emphasized here is the peaceful nature of this conversion, regardless of the legend surrounding it. The role of autochthonous chiefs. The second period of Islamization was marked by the conversion of the people, whether through automatic imitation of their chiefs or through some violent action of these chiefs, sometimes going beyond their borders and becoming veritable holy wars. All such holy wars were conducted by black chiefs. The king of the town of Silla in the 11th century was already waging holy war against the inhabitants of Kalanfu, as had Askia Muhammad against the Masai emperor Nasere, Amadou Sheikhu against the Damal of Kayor, and Lat Dior Diop against Koki in 1875. Usman Dan Fodio, 1801, El Haj Omar, 1850, and Amadou, 1884, were the great religious conquerors of the Sudan in the 19th century. With the Sultan of Djenne, Kanbaro, we witness the phenomenon of automatic imitation of the sovereign by the people. They adopted the faith of Islam immediately following the conversion of the king. The Tariq-es-Sudan places this event in the 6th century of the Hijra, 12th century. Sadi fails to mention the name of the Muslim scholar who must have exerted a religious influence on the king of Djenne, but the fact seems undeniable. When he decided to change his religion, he summoned all the ulemas living in the country and renounced the traditional faith in their presence. This instance substantiates the ideas already expressed. These ulemas, these solitary marabouts, not only were unable to undertake any military action to convert their sovereigns, but absolutely needed their protection and the goodwill of political, social circles to live safely in the land during the transitional period before the conversion of the king. Such royal conversions were, moreover, taken amiss by the people, and all of the sovereign's prestige was needed for them to be accepted. It occasionally happened that a converted king concealed his new religious convictions from his people as long as possible. This was the case with Khan Mer, the son of Besai, who ruled the town of Alukin near Gayal in Bakri's day. The special character of conversions effected by national chiefs is that the latter, however ruthless their methods, could never have been considered, in the eyes of the people, as foreign oppressors or as being in the league with such. Impossible as it was for the people to see El Haj Omar and the others as agents of a colonizing power, just so inevitably did the missionaries see them in this light. Metaphysical reasons. A third cause for the success of Islam in Africa seems to reside in a certain metaphysical relationship between African beliefs and the Muslim tradition. In the latter there is to be found an invisible world, a doppelganger of the visible one. It is indeed an exact replica of it, but the initiate alone can see it. Askia Muhammad, in carrying out his pilgrimage to Mecca, having come back by way of Egypt, pitched camp not far from Cairo for the night. He was accompanied at that time, among other scholars, by one Saleh Diawara. The latter was able to see and shake hands with the Muslim genie Cham Haruk. According to the Islamic tradition related to Kati, this was a beneficent genie, whose followers were like marabouts and made pilgrimages like them. Around him there were some free genies, for in that spirit world There are also slaves, some good and some evil. The malevolent, pagan genies, just like their counterparts in our visible world, go to hell when they die. They spend their time in tormenting us. In 1928, following the death of Ahmadu Bamba, originator of the Mohammedan sect of the Muridis, a great wind swept the region of his capital, Jurodale, for an entire day. It was blowing toward the sea, and it was spontaneously concluded that this was the genie who had accompanied the holy man during his exile in Gabon, now returning to the ocean. Everyone was convinced that during his life this genie never left his side, acting in a way as his rampart against all evil. This metaphysical being is not to be confused with a guardian angel. It goes without saying that this conception of a dual world is to be found in various forms in the beliefs of Africans to such a point they feel completely comfortable in Islam. Some of them do not even feel they have changed their metaphysical horizon. That is what led Dan Fodio to criticize severely all those who, through calling themselves Muslims, continue such practices as libations, offerings, divinations, the Kabbalah, etc., and even write verses from the Quran in the blood of sacrificed animals. Dan Fodio's text, although rather recent, 19th century, reflects a tendency already imperative in the days of the Askias, 15th, 17th centuries. African religions, more or less forgotten, were in the process of atrophying and being emptied of their spiritual content, their former deep metaphysics. The jumble of empty forms they had left behind could not compete with Islam on the moral or rational level, and it was on that latter level of rationality that the victory of Islam was most striking. That was the fourth cause of its success. The imperative need for rationality reflected in the writings of Dan Fodio was henceforth better satisfied by Islam than by the dying traditional faiths. Nevertheless, it must be noted that in the domain of artistic creativity, the Islamized African underwent for a long time a throttling, a kind of cultural impoverishment. During the initial years of Mohammedanism, strict formalism was needed, so as to check any return to idolatry through the devices of artistic representation. It will be recalled under what conditions Islam triumphed over Sabiism. Therefore, it was necessary to prescribe for centuries any representation in animal form and even more so in human form. The notion of God, especially, was one which might not be concretized by means of art. Exegetes of Islam may realize today that this phase of fears is considered historically outgrown within the framework of the evolution of Muslim consciousness. It is unthinkable that the renaissance of sculptural and pictorial art, featuring the human form, might entail an offensive return to idolatry in any Muslim country. Power of religious beliefs. What was the strength of religious belief in pre-colonial Islamic Africa, its political and social role, the imprint it left? In the Sudan, the reign of Askia Muhammad was a watershed. Before him, it seems, to a certain degree at least, the Islamism of the emperors of Gael was rather fragile. With the last two of these, if we are to believe Kati, there was an undisguised hostility. Askia Muhammad was only the lieutenant of Sunni Ali, whose faith was very lukewarm. His son, Baro, who replaced him, refused to embrace Islam. Muhammad became a dissident and insistently urged Baro to convert. Following negotiations, which lasted 52 days and were conducted in large part by the scholar Saleh Diawara, already allied with the future Askia, the two went into battle. Baro stood firm. There was no question of his embracing Islam. In this he went further than his father, who had apparently been converted. The battle ended with his defeat. Kati considers that God thus assured the Askia's victory over the infidel, which is quite reminiscent of the episode mentioned in La Chanson de Roland. Charlemagne, the Christian emperor, emerged victorious over the Saracens at Roncesvalles because the swords of his men, especially that of Roland, were guided by the angel Gabriel. From the Christian viewpoint, this was a victory of light over darkness. Islam was and remains in large part a living religion in Black Africa, in contrast to the Christianity of the West, which tends to become among Europeans a mere religious custom. The Askias included the ulemas in all their imperial decisions. After Salih Diawara had informed the Askia of what he witnessed at his interview with Cheikh Baro, the prince called together his council, made up of the ulemas, the notables, and the chiefs of his army, and consulted them as to the course of action he should pursue. Islam practically ran the government under Askia Muhammad. Qadi Mahmud did not hesitate to dismiss the envoys of the Askia and purely and simply refused to obey his orders. Not only did this do him no harm, but he was able to address the Askia as follows, using the familiar thou form. Have you forgotten, or do you pretend to have forgotten, the day you come to see me at my home, and you seized my foot and my clothing, saying, I have come to place myself under your protection and entrust you my person, so that you may save me from the flames of hell? Help me and hold me by the hand, so that I may not to fall into hell. I entrust myself to you. This is the reason why I dismissed your envoys and disobeyed your orders. This action, by which one entrusts his metaphysical lot, his fate in the hereafter, to a living saint, is characteristic of the marabout phase of Islam in West Africa. The marabouts are the living intermediaries between layman and the prophet, who is in direct communication with God. After death, the marabouts raise their disciples up to paradise, carrying them on their shoulders past purgatory. In Wolof, the Jerzy Jirat. It is while the saint is asleep that his soul, his double, leaves his body to go and carry out such missions of rescue. One can see the reason why even a king like Askia Muhammad would feel it imperative to entrust himself to such a savior. So, in Black Africa, to this very day, despite the formal doctrines of the Quran, there are no believers who dedicate themselves only to God and His Prophet. A third personage, the one known as his marabout, is needed by all laymen, from the masses up to the sovereign. The power of Islam was such that it might have eliminated or attenuated slavery in the Middle Ages if it had decreed that the enslavement of one man by another was a mortal sin. But the Quran's point of view on this question is shaded. One may have a slave under the following conditions to begin with: if he is a prisoner of a holy war, but then he must be educated, cared for, and converted. But on the other hand, it is forbidden to take a slave as a Muslim, as well educated as oneself. So a slave must be freed as soon as he reaches the intellectual level of his master. But that as it may, during the period under consideration, it is quite clear that it was the fear of hell which kept the faithful within the moral discipline of religion. Mystical underpinning of nationalism. Islam has often been the mystical underpinning of African nationalism. This explains the fantastic epics of the Mahdi, 1881, the national hero and liberator of the former Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, Rabah, 1878, and the conquering Tukulors of the Senegal River and Western Sudan. The wars of the Mahdi, with their unusual character, derive a little more attention. The Mahdi, according to Muslim tradition, is the Messiah, the Savior who, before the end of the world, will bring the entire earth to Islam. Proclaiming himself such, one Muhammad Ahmed, a Sudanese by origin, galvanized his men and succeeded in defeating Rashid Bey, the governor of Fashoda. In 1882, he defeated an Egyptian column and occupied all the Kordofan. He completely massacred an army of 10,000 men commanded by Hicks Pasha. In 1883, Slatin Pasha, the British governor of Darfur, and Lupton Bey, the British governor of Bahr el Ghazal, who effected Arab alliances, as did the former, were also beaten by him. They capitulated in 1884. He conquered the Berber country as well as the Sennar. On January 26, 1885, he entered the citadel of Khartoum and there slew Gordon Pasha, Chinese Gordon. 8/10 of the Sudanese territory had been reconquered from the Anglo-Egyptian coalition opposing the Sudanese blacks when he died. His victory was the more valiant in that the victorious Sudanese had only bows and arrows, while the Anglo-Egyptians were equipped with the most modern firearms available. The West was stupefied by the event, which brought a shout of admiration from Friedrich Engels. The victory of Amadou Shekou over Lat Dior, cited earlier, was due to just such causes. The Damel of Cairo owed his salvation to the help of General Faidherbe, whom he was able to get as an ally in this circumstance. The Tukulors, accompanied by women, fought while singing hymns that had a profound effect on both the soldiers and their enemies. According to the accounts I received from my maternal grandmother, the Tukulors were fanaticized, the Cairorians terrified. The secular pseudo-nationalism of the latter, their mundane Tiedo spirit, very quickly fell before the unshakable faith of the Tukulors, who, of course, were convinced they would go directly to paradise when they died on the battlefield of this holy war. African nationalism among them had found an efficacious mystical underpinning. The difference between the extraordinary epic of Samory and that of the Mahdi consists in the fact that Samory, although a Muslim, acted without any mystical underpinning to his nationalism, as if he had weighed the consequences of it. He was able to crystallize the national resistance of almost all the territories of West Africa on a strictly secular basis without the assistance of any belief, idea, or foreign power to galvanize his troops. He did not wage holy wars as had Askia Muhammad or the religious leaders of the 19th century. He waged a national resistance of the very best Vercingetorix type. In his childhood, Samory lived in the circumstances of the masses as an African chieftain rarely had. This was what the originality of his political action and his glory were perhaps due to. Although of lesser magnitude, the resistance of Behanazin, the last king of Dahomey, end of the 19th century, and that of Lat Dior, Senegal, were of the same type. As for Shaka, the Zulu chief, it will be necessary to make further studies to ascertain whether the English succeeded in channeling his turbulence inward toward the other African clans and tribes, or whether he was consciously making ready so that when the time came he might deal them a decisive blow. The fact was that due to the modus vivendi which was always respected, Shaka never waged war against the English in South Africa. On the other hand, the military and social organization with which he endowed his army and his people was the most technical and efficient of all those in Black Africa in modern times. It contributed mightily to the rapid and systematic fusion of the Zulu clans and tribes and the birth of the present-day nationalities in South Africa. Shaka's internal conquests were as rapid as they were extraordinarily far-reaching. It is for all these reasons that he is sometimes referred to as the Napoleon of Black Africa, or at least of South Africa. Shaka never followed European examples. Renunciation of the pre-Islamic past. Islam, in contrast to present-day Christianity, takes no account of the traditional past. The Christian West of today proudly recognizes its classical pagan heritage and does its utmost to preserve the works of that period. One discovers nothing of the sort in Islamized countries. The equivalent of the Western pagan past must be hushed up, renounced, permanently forgotten. A museum in Mecca filled with relics from the Sabian period would be pure idolatry, an unthinkable initiative from the Muslim viewpoint. Reasons such as these explain why today the blacks of Khartoum have a sense of shame at acknowledging their relationship to the ancient past of Meroe. The ruins from that period, the 84 pyramids still standing in the ancient capital, the temple of Semna, Meroitic writing, the remains of the astronomical observatories, the vestiges of the metal industry which made the Sudan the Birmingham of antiquity. All this is of no interest because it is tainted with a pagan tradition no good Muslim would think of recalling. How could they, in all decency, hark back to those people who knew nothing of the Quran and who did not pray as we do now, to a time before religious wisdom. Sherifism. One might term as Sherifism the irresistible impulse on the part of most Muslim chiefs of black Africa to link themselves, by whatever sort of acrobatics, to the family tree of Muhammad. One of my uncles, Martar Low, maintained until his dying day that 20 ancestors whose names he would quote linked him to the Prophet. Anyone who disagreed with him was a heretic. This tendency spread throughout Africa. After the introduction of Islam in the 8th century, all the royal families without distinction after Islamization invented Sherifian origins for themselves, often retroactively adjusting local history. This was the case of the royal branch of the Diaz of Kukia, the former capital of Songhai before Gao, until the 11th century. An oral post-Islamic etymology has it that Dia derives from Jamin el-Yamin. He came from Yemen. It seems there were two brothers, natives of southern Arabia, who arrived in that region in the most piteous state, barely able to conceal their nakedness under bits of animal hide. Whenever they were asked where they came from, one of them would answer in Arabic with the aforementioned expression. Henceforth, that was the name of the elder of the two. After he defeated the fish known as Demon of the River, which was king of the region and periodically emerged from the water to dictate its laws, he supplanted it at the head of the nation and founded the Dia dynasty. Such legends have proliferated in black Africa since Islam came in and have contributed to altering the authentic history of the continent. We find variants of them for the genesis of the first dynasties of Ghana, Bornu, Wadai, all of the Kordofan, and so on. On the other hand, a migration starting from the Nile Valley seems beyond doubt, to the extent that even today it can be substantiated by the ethnic names of the various clans. This migration, however, is mentioned nowhere except in pre-Islamic legends that gradually grow vaguer and vaguer, according to which, as noted by Delafosse, the blacks of West Africa relate their ancestors came from the east, from around the Great Water. We will see that very probably this Great Water is the Nile rather than the Indian Ocean. Consciousness of the continuity of the people's historical past has been progressively weakened by religious influences. Even within our own families, we know that our parents prefer to forget systematically and keep their children unaware of a certain pagan past, which it has become indiscreet to mention, except for a few nostalgic reminiscences. In the search for ancestors as far away as Yemen, they might have been better off to stop at the Nile Basin, but this happens less and less often because, beginning with the 7th century, the history of that region appeared as if polluted by the image of the Pharaoh, the biblical curse on whom is perpetuated in Islam. However that may be, Mohammedan black Africa in the Middle Ages was no less original than Christian Europe at the close of antiquity. Both continents were invaded in the same way by alien monotheistic religions, which ended up being at the foundation of the entire socio-political organization, ruling philosophical thought and carrying forward intellectual and moral values during this whole period. A hierarchy as powerful, old, and permanent as that of the Christian Church is non existent in Islam. It is the replica on the religious level of the old Roman administrative organization. Immediately after the wars of the times of the first caliphates, there was coexistence and reciprocal tolerance among the different sects. None prevailed sufficiently to be able to anathematize the others and consider them schismatic, so as to erect a durable hierarchy upon its own concepts and its own interpretation of the religious text. This situation gave rise in Black Africa to the possibility of a multiplicity of sects. Thus, alongside the old Tijane sect, native to North Africa and propagated by El Hajj Malik Sai in Senegal, there appeared at the beginning of the 20th century the new Murid sect, created by Amadou Bamba. The French authorities very quickly interpreted this as the integrating of Islam into local nationalism. Instead of expressively recommending a pilgrimage to Mecca, considering the material obligations one would have to fulfill vis-a-vis its family so as to be in a position to make such a journey, Muridism created shrines on the local level. Jurabel, the residence of Amadou Bamba, with its mosque, was the substitute for Mecca during the Marabout's life. After his death, it was shifted to Touba, where he is buried. Thus, from 1900 to 1935, no Murid made a pilgrimage to Mecca. The idea of making one occurred to no one, not even the creator of the sect. Cheikh Anta, the most independent of all the young brothers of Amadou Bamba, thought of making it only after Amadou Bamba's death. To recapitulate then, in the Middle Ages, the religious superstructure played an equally important role in Europe and in Africa. Christianity gave the West political, administrative organization and ensured the continuity of historical consciousness. Islam in Black Africa merely superimposed itself on the political administrative organization, even when, in consequence of the cosmopolitanism of the period, a foreigner, Arab or otherwise, was invested with a position by the sovereign. He bore the indigenous title. The sense of an ancient past was weakening, but the Arab chroniclers noted the events of African history with praiseworthy objectivity. Their writings today constitute a precious source of documentation. In Europe, as in Islamized Black Africa, the notion of the seven arts, that is, the trivium and the quadrivium, was carried forward, as we shall see in the following chapter. End of chapter 7.